This video covers Module 1 Part D, Ethics in Marketing and Audience Research. In this video I'll talk about why ethics in research is important, and specifically in social and behavioural sciences disciplines like marketing. I'll talk through what some of the key principles of research ethics that apply to us are and where they come from. I'll go through the history of that and how those stem from biomedical ethics, which helps to really drive home why it's important to adhere to those. I'll finish off by talking about industry ethics that apply within Australia. An important distinction to be aware of is the difference between morals and ethics, or the difference between the terms morals and ethics. Frequently those two terms are used interchangeably, but they are slightly different. So morals refers to what we as individuals think of as right or wrong, good or bad. Not necessarily legally, but morally, what we personally think of as good or bad, right or wrong. Ethics, on the other hand, is what the group to which we belong considers good or bad, right or wrong. So morals is at the individual level, ethics is at the group level. Sometimes we can have a conflict there where our own personal morals conflict with the ethics of the wider groups. For example, I might believe that pirating music is morally acceptable. I don't have an issue with it, but ethically the society to which I belong deems that unacceptable. So we have a little bit of a conflict there. If ethics is at the group level, then obviously we need to think about the groups to which we belong, and sometimes there can be a discrepancy across groups as well. So you can think about belonging to different cultures, or multiple cultures at the same time, or multiple subcultures, different societal groups, different professions. Each of these can have slightly differing ethics, interpretations of what's considered right or wrong, and that can lead to a little bit of conflict for individuals as well. So be aware of the distinction between morals and ethics. In this lecture we're primarily talking about ethics, because what we do as researchers ultimately involves a wide range of people, so we need to consider those behaviours that are acceptable at the group level. Three broad classifications of ethics to be aware of are listed on the screen. So consequentialist ethics, deontological ethics, and virtue-based ethics. These are the three broad categories of ethics that we're interested in looking at for the purposes of this video. Just be aware that there are a whole range of subcategories to each of these perspectives, and there's a lot of crossover categories between them. People can devote their entire careers to studying ethical perspectives, but for our purposes we're just interested in these three. It's important to be aware of these distinctions because it's when an individual has an appreciation or acceptance of multiple ethical perspectives at the same time that they experience ethical dilemmas. So you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. So someone holding a consequentialist perspective on ethics basically looks at a course of action or looks at some behaviour and judges that as good or bad based on the ultimate consequences that it creates. Right? So not necessarily just the act that they engage in, but the ultimate consequences down the road. So the classic example when talking about consequentialist ethics is the act of war. War is naturally destructive. People die, property gets damaged, people get harmed and so forth. So it's a very bad thing. But ultimately what a consequentialist would say is if that leads to peace and prosperity down the track, then it can be seen as quite an ethical behaviour. From a marketing perspective, we can think about something like fear appeals. Within advertising, for example, fear appeals are used to dissuade people from engaging in behaviours such as drink driving, taking drugs, from bullying behaviour, from domestic violence and those sorts of things. But they do cause people distress. A lot of those ads contain graphic imagery that are designed to shock people, designed to distress people, and therefore discourage them from engaging in those behaviours. A lot of society will say, and a lot of ethical principles will say, exposing people to distressing images is a bad thing and we shouldn't do it. A consequentialist would look at that situation and say, ultimately, if that exposure to those images causes people to not engage in these harmful behaviours, then it's a positive thing and we should do it. By the same token, we can think about the situation of wanting to look at the impact of cigarette smoke on young children and how that affects them later in life. If a hardline consequentialist was setting up an experiment to examine that, what they'd do is maybe take two groups of children and expose one group of children to cigarette smoke from a young age, another group of children to no cigarette smoke from a young age, and compare differences as they grow up. They look at those kids and they say, well, it's terrible for those kids, but ultimately if this study allows us to find out the effects of smoking on children, then it's a positive thing. The deontological perspective on ethics is largely rule-driven. So deontological individuals think about the moral duties and rules to which they have to abide. So these are societal rules often that have a basis in religion or an origin in religion and so forth. So here thinking about what society says is acceptable, what society tells us is right or wrong. Typically society might say that it's wrong to expose people to distressing images, or it's wrong to expose small children to cigarette smoke, so therefore those things are bad, they're unethical. The situation of having an ethical dilemma arises when someone can see value in both of those perspectives at the same time. So I see value in honouring society and not exposing people to fear images, but ultimately I see a benefit from that. I'm not sure what I should do. Right? Or I see value in learning whether or not cigarette smoke affects children, but I at the same time don't want to go against what society says is acceptable, therefore I have an ethical dilemma. Virtue-based ethics is the third one to be aware of. This is more a subjective, individualistic type of ethics, where the course of action is judged as good or bad based on what the individual considers a virtuous person would do. So would a virtuous person give small children cigarettes or expose small children to cigarette smoke? No, they wouldn't. Therefore, that would be seen as an unethical action. So it's not just about what society says is right or wrong. It's one step above that, I guess, where you think about what a virtuous person would actually do. So three broad categories of ethics to be aware of, which give rise to ethical dilemmas when people can appreciate more than one perspective at any one time. And of course, ethical dilemmas arise throughout every stage of the research cycle or the research process. Ethics in marketing research is obviously important because we firstly want to do the right thing by society, and we also want to achieve a purposeful outcome or a meaningful outcome, but also because we depend on the continued support and goodwill of the community and the trust from the community that we're doing the right thing in order for research to proceed. If the community doesn't trust the findings that we produce, then we no longer have a basis for conducting research. Because we do confront many ethical dilemmas throughout the research process, there are industry codes of conduct or professional codes of conduct that have been developed, and these exist in most professions nowadays, but they've been developed to help guide anyone with an ethical dilemma by specifying what people should and shouldn't do in certain situations and how to go about conducting research. Alright, a little bit of a history around why we have the ethical principles in place today that we do have. I think that's quite important to understand where they come from, because it helps us to have an appreciation of why we need to behave ethically. So in disciplines like consumer behavior or marketing, where we are interacting or conducting research with people, any of the social sciences that involves research with people, the ethical principles that apply there really stem from biomedical research ethics. Now, biomedical research ethics became quite topical after the Second World War last century. So not all that long ago in the scheme of things. Research ethics and ethics in general has been discussed well before then, but it became quite topical after the Second World War, and particularly around the time of the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were the trials of the Nazi prison officers and the Nazi researchers or Nazi surgeons who conducted research in the name of science by experimenting and running studies on concentration camp prisoners. Some of the types of studies that were conducted by the Nazi surgeons listed up on the screen here. So for example, exposing people to freezing temperatures or to high altitudes to see how their bodies would react. And some of the justifications given for that were things like, well, we want to know what our pilots would be able to withstand when flying at high altitudes. Exposing people to noxious agents or diseases to see how their body reacts. Some of the studies were really quite horrific, and I'll put a link in the learning resources on Blackboard where you can read more about those if you'd like. One thing that they used to justify this was that they probably would have done those same experiments prior to the war. It was just that there was no ethical guidelines in place. So out of the Nuremberg trials grew what's termed the Nuremberg Code of Medical Ethics. So we have a very similar code, or a code based on very similar principles today in the social sciences, and this has evolved over time. But some of the key principles are stated there on the screen. We can see that the first one is that people, in order to take part in a study, have to give informed consent. So not just consent into a study, but informed consent. So they have to understand what the study is about, or the nature of that study, in order for them to take part. We say that the informed consent has to be given freely, so they can't be requested or placed under duress to give consent, and that consent has to be taken prior to the study or prior to the experiment. Research has to be conducted that avoids unnecessary physical or psychological suffering. There has to be avoidance of research that's likely to cause injury. Obviously that's important. And those sorts of things, so the physical and psychological suffering and the potential for injury, always have to be balanced off against there being some broader or larger benefit for society. So when researchers create a research project, often that has to go before a research panel or a research committee, especially university research that goes through a very rigorous process. And as part of that, the researcher has to explain what the benefits are for society and how they outweigh potential risks for things like harm or whatever, even if that's minimal, such as inconvenience to the participant. The research has to be conducted by qualified individuals, and importantly, this final one at the end, participants always have to be allowed to discontinue the research at any time. So this one kind of links back to the informed consent idea, that not only do people have to consent into the study, but they also have to be allowed to opt out of the study if they change their mind. So principles such as these guide medical research today and also guide social sciences research. Some other influential studies that we'll talk about at the in-person session are listed here on the screen. And I've placed some links in the learning resources section of Blackboard so you can read a little bit more about these studies. So 3 very controversial studies that have led to a further evolution of ethical principles that we have today. They're very interesting. Now, in terms of research being conducted at QUT and within universities more broadly in Australia, all universities have to accord by the National Statement on Conduct in Human Research, and that's a very extensive statement, or a very extensive code that we have to abide by. All research conducted in relation to people or human beings that researchers in universities undertake has to go through that process and abide by those principles. You can familiarize yourself with QUT's version of those principles or interpretation of those principles by clicking on the link there. You'll see that the research that you're going to undertake with your participant very much accords with those principles. If you look on the consent form that your participant is going to sign, you'll see that it has sections corresponding to the key principles that we went through previously. So in terms of informed consent, you can see sections relating to a description of what the study entails and what participating in the study involves. You'll see details of benefits of the study and also any potential risks associated with the study. And with your study, as with most marketing studies, the description given there is usually that there are no risks beyond just regular day-to-day living. Your participant will sign that form, and you'll need to submit that in hard copy to your tutor because Queensland regulations require that consent forms such as these are stored in hard copy for 15 years by the university. So your consent forms need to be delivered to your tutor. Your tutor leaves them with me, and I actually store those for 15 years. Alright, so you might be wondering, well, outside of university, what sort of regulation exists? We have two main industry bodies within Australia that help to regulate market researchers and social researchers. As I've mentioned before, AMSRS is the Australian Market and Social Research Society, and this is the body that individual researchers will sign up to. Once they sign up, they have to accord with the Code of Professional Conduct provided by AMSRS, which ensures that they are acting responsibly. If individual researchers don't sign up to AMSRS, then the national privacy principles still apply, but they can usually get additional work. They're given a little bit of extra credibility by being members of AMSRS. AMSRO is the additional body, so that's the Association of Market and Social Research Organisations, and this is the body that research consultancies, research organisations actually sign up to. So AMSRS for individuals, AMSRO for organisations. Together, AMSRS and AMSRO make up the Research Industry Council of Australia. In terms of looking at all of the regulatory framework within Australia, you can see here that individual standards as applicable to AMSRS are the AMSRS Code of Professional Behaviour, also the Qualified Practicing Market Researchers Scheme, the QPMR. In terms of companies, we've got the Australian Standard for Market Opinion and Social Research, the Quality Standard for Online Access Panels, and the Market and Social Research Privacy Principles, which is based on the Commonwealth Privacy Act. All of those are the frameworks which dictate the ethical principles that researchers have to accord by. So in general, there is a lot of regulation there and a lot of assurance that people are going to do the right thing. Alright, in terms of this video, what you can tick off having achieved is an understanding of three broad perspectives of research ethics that can dictate whether or not someone experiences an ethical dilemma or how they might think about an ethical stance. That's the consequentialist, deontological and virtue-based ethics perspectives. We went through some of the history of ethics and why we have the principles in place today, and also some of those ethical frameworks that we have for market and social research in Australia. For the next video, we'll be talking about qualitative research.